of as far as, oh, that's good to know, as far as Christian virtues are concerned. Those virtues certainly transcend the boundaries of Christianity, though they are formed and they're revealed in a particular way through faith in Christ and faith in God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so they're kind of where I wanted to start. But you don't need to know very much about the Bible or very much about theological context to be able to get a handle on how those values appear, often in really exciting ways, in Evelyn De Morgan's work. When it comes to spiritualism, many of you will know that especially in the 19th century, things like seances became incredibly popular. And there were also organizations, these clandestine esoteric groups like the Golden Dawn, and also like a wider interest in theosophy, the rise of Unitarianism. And that for the De Morgans, as far as I'm aware, there was no great break or great struggle. Neither of them, say, came from a very conservative evangelical Christian background and suddenly became inspired by this revolution. Both of them were, and especially I think Evelyn De Morgan in this way, really open to a whole variety of spiritual possibilities and wanted to explore them broadly and widely in art, as well as in mind and in ideas. There is a wonderful book, which I believe has recently been acquired by the collection. They have a copy of it now, that connects to the experiments with seances and automatic writing that both Evelyn De Morgan and William De Morgan engaged with. So those are the kinds of things that they're exploring alongside thinking in a very direct way about angels, saints, and the life of Christ. And so that is where I want to begin, if I can. There we go. So here we have her engagement with the First World War. You can see the crosses on the ruined battlefield in the lower right-hand corner of the image. And I also wanted to connect it with a preparatory sketch that Evelyn De Morgan made of this same image, because there are some significant differences here, which I thought were really beautiful, that have to do with the hands of the angels supporting Christ, not here crucified, but in fact kind of suspended in the air. And we might talk about this as a victorious image of Christ, but there's also something ethereally gentle and compassionate about this. The depiction of Christ's garments in red and the use of rainbows is relatively unusual, but there is a nice parallel. And I haven't got this for you, which is really silly. And I know that there are at least a couple of people in the Zoom room today who know a lot about these things. There is a really nice similarity with images of Christ by Edward Burne-Jones in Birmingham Cathedral, which he did in stained glass right at the end of the 19th century. And so the other warning that I'm going to put on this talk is that I didn't really mean to, but there's a lot of Burne-Jones in my talk this afternoon. And part of the reason for that is that there are so many interesting parallels, but also because I think we've got to work through and be honest about a real tension, at least on Burne-Jones's part, with his perception about Evelyn De Morgan and her work. And so as we go on, I just like to read this to you now so that you have this in mind. So here is what Burne-Jones had to say about De Morgan. Her work is a kind of eclectic mixture of George Frederick Watts and me and old Florentine Renaissance work. The colors of some of them are extremely beautiful if you look close in at them. Yet at a distance, the whole has no beauty of color at all. The faces are so pretty with such nice expressions, but the figures are so badly drawn. If this girl had left figure painting alone and gone about the world modestly and happily doing pretty views, cities, flowers, and every beautiful thing she came across in nature with a cheerful mind, she would have done admirable and useful work that would have been a pleasure to everybody. But these pictures are only a bore and an anomaly. Now, if that is not the jealous fragility of canonical patriarchy at work, I do not know what is. And especially because I'm so interested in Burne-Jones's work and in how it speaks into modern as well as historicist and medievalist Victorianism. Reading this actually makes me really sad, but it also is the declaration of someone who is actually really threatened by the skillfulness and by the ingeniousness of what De Morgan is doing. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well. One of the things that I also really like about this picture is the relationship between Christ's garments and the wings of the angel, as though the radiant love of Christ is pouring directly out into the experience of love that the angels are returning back to him. There is, however, no specific connection at least not visually, not facially, between Christ and any of the angels. And so each of these faces acts like a kind of potential response that each of us could have to gazing upon Christ ourselves, though Christ does not meet our gaze either, seems to have his eyes and his countenance fixed on other things, on the realm of hope and the realm of glory, far above the barren tragedy of the Great War. One of the very first paintings that Evelyn De Morgan debuted in 1876 was an image of St. Catherine of Alexandria. And a lot of the time, scholars focus much more on her classical allegories, but I think it's really exciting that a lot of her work does involve saints and that this is where she started. Here I've got a sketch on the right, and those of you who are observant know that that's most certainly not Evelyn De Morgan's painting of Catherine of Alexandria on the left, but it's Raphael's painting from about 1509, from the early 16th century. And Evelyn De Morgan, on the one hand, was looking to explore things in a genuinely new and vibrant way. And on the other, or at least in connection with that and integrated with that, was really delighted by what she was seeing as a kind of color and a sense of compositional clarity, as well as a sense of emotional theological response to God that she saw in Renaissance art, as we heard in that catty, bitchy comment of Burne-Jones's, especially in Florence, which she visited on a very regular basis and was very closely connected with. I wanted to show you this too, to bring us back to angels for a moment. And here we have this glorious image of the realms of heaven depicted in a couple of ways. In one way, the images of heaven and earth merge here because these angels are on this sort of ethereal coastland, a liminal space, not just between heaven and earth, but between land and sea. One of them has a scroll and the other has a musical instrument. The idea of the music of the spheres and the music of the possibility of the heavenly realm beyond the earthly, beyond the material, was really inspirational for Evelyn De Morgan. And you can see too how this connects to this orb of putti, which seemed to be descending as well as moving outwards, threatening in the best kind of way to exceed the surface of the picture, to be able to move beyond the frame on either side, so that those two angels can themselves be enfolded within the fluttering wings of the putti above. You may also be able to see right at the top that there's this little cascade of light, and that kind of way of depicting light is pretty typical for a way of depicting the Holy Spirit. Every time De Morgan, like any other artist, is struggling with what a colleague of mine, Chloe Reddaway, calls the audacity of painting God. She specifically is speaking about the audacity of trying to paint Christ as fully human and fully divine. And what I love about De Morgan's work is that she completely and wholly embraces that struggle, not only looking to the past, but making things that are genuinely new. As far as newness is concerned, there was an awful lot of concern about the relationship between materiality and leading a life which was more simple, perhaps free from those material concerns in De Morgan's work. This is a work that she bases on Matthew chapter 6, you cannot worship God and Mammon. And there's an interesting issue here with this painting because it too is often, I'm just going to spread out so that I can see my notes properly here, is often connected with a work by the Victorian painter George Frederick Watts. Watts was known as England's Michelangelo in his own time. He was a really accomplished portrait painter as well as a painter of allegory and of a whole variety of things that really brought to mind the relationship between love and death, and beginnings and endings, as well as what he saw as an urgent need for a reappraisal of social justice in his own time and what kinds of values really mattered. So on the one hand, it makes sense to think about Watts's appraisal of Mammon and this moment that from a biblical reference alongside Evelyn De Morgan's, but they're actually really different. And so here on the right, is Watts's image of Mammon. And so you can immediately see in terms of composition that these two are really very different. And I think one way of looking at it is that Watts's Mammon is like super scary. He has the money bags in his lap, but he also has two skulls either side of his throne. And the two figures, especially with the touch, with the contact, as though he's really got his hand on her neck, of man and woman, representing here the whole of humanity. They're not clothed, but they are naked. And as you come down the body of Mammon, you'll be able to see that he's wearing these rather snazzy red boots, and that one of them is right on the rib, resting on the chest, pressure and pulling down the figure on the chest of this man here. So both of them have really lost all their power. They are completely powerless before this uncaring image of Mammon. And on the left, you have something completely different, not only in terms of color, but also certainly in terms of composition. And here there is a kind of an alluring quality that this female figure finds, no image of a male figure at all, in the idea as well as the sculpted body of Mammon. So the way that De Morgan is playing with the idea of flesh and sculpture and some kind of idolatry is really interesting here as well. The flowing drapery, which is a hallmark of De Morgan and many other painters in this period, not only Burne-Jones, but Frederick Leighton and those who were in that circle around Holland Park. That flowing drapery allows us to be able to see how the body curves up and brings us into Mammon's space, as well as seeing the way that his outstretched arm is a kind of imprisonment. So he's clutching this bag in his arm instead of what we see with almost kind of the hand fondling these bags of wealth in Watts's picture. There's a lot more to say, I think, in comparing these two. But one way of looking at this is that, yes, Watts painted this subject, and so did Evelyn De Morgan. But not only have they done it differently, they've done it in a way that expresses something really different about the relationship between the human heart, perhaps the human soul, and materialism and the idolatry that comes along with that, unfortunately, and the figure of Mammon itself. A meditation here on a similar theme. This is a sketch, and this sketch is, I think, really profound and really tragic. It's a study for what she called Earthbound, and one of the deep sadnesses of it is that the character that we have lying on the ground counting his coins is, in a sense, imprisoned, almost bound by the ropes of his beautiful and glittering chains. And so gold is related here, not to the golden rays of the sun in the background on the sea. And again, there's this shore, which is representing not only the idea of solid and liquid, but also the idea of a kind of a heavenly realm and an earthly realm, where part of what makes him trapped is that he believes in some way that he's unable to turn around. That means that he's not only unable to view and experience the greater glory of the rising sun, or perhaps the setting sun, discuss, but he's also unable to perceive the way that this female figure is cascading drapery around him. Now, if we compare that with Mammon and the way that Mammon is holding that bag of gold in his hand, here it's delightfully unclear. It's, I think, really quite ambivalent. And you tell me what you think at the end of the talk, whether or not this figure is in a position of potential salvation or is in a position of potential continued imprisonment. The view and the allegorical principles that are attending this figure are wonderfully ambiguous. And that's one of the things that I think also really distinguishes the way that De Morgan's work works. The kind of labor that she makes us do as the viewer is one of the great satisfactions of looking at her pictures, whether they're sketches like this one or whether they're fully finished paintings. I want to go back for a second into De Morgan's early life and talk to you a little bit, just with this picture as a holding image really, about the evolution of her relationship to art when she was really quite young, and the way that she ended up in art school as one of the few women at the time who was experiencing that for herself. And this is from an early 1920s account of William De Morgan and Evelyn De Morgan, which, as some of you will know, is called William De Morgan and His Wife, which is delightful. So here we are. She worked and studied, and before the age of 12, she was painting in oils. But the results of her labor were more difficult to hide than the materials with which she did it, and in consequence, she utilized every surface which presented itself as available for her purpose. She had little pocket money, so she secreted blocks of wood to draw upon, or used the insides of box lids, since it was unlikely that anyone would search these for drawings. As a further precaution when working, she always had a piece of drapery ready to fling over the paraphernalia which might otherwise have revealed her occupation. At length one day the inevitable happened. In her eagerness to get to work, she forgot to lock the door, and her mother entered before she had time to conceal what she was doing. The girl burst into excited tears and declared she had been forced into a deception because she could not live without painting. After that, a virtue was made of necessity, and opposition was grudgingly withdrawn. If paint she must, it was better to paint well than badly. So a first-class drawing master was again engaged, who for a guinea an hour condescended to instruct her in copying fruit and flowers. Evelyn promptly explained to him that what she wanted was to learn anatomy of human beings, not plants. But he turned a deaf ear to all her representations and assured her that the subjects that he selected were appropriate. So it was a struggle, really. And that subject matter, as you will have heard earlier, is the kind of subject matter suitable for women that Edward Burne-Jones really wished that she had stuck with, but that isn't what happened. She went to the Slade in the early 1870s. She trained with the artist E.J. Poynter, and Edward Poynter was hugely influential for an enormous number of artists, as well as in his own artistic career as a painter. And it's not atypical that he did this, but he was really focusing with his students on using classical as well as biblical models. And so it makes sense that following on from this training in her own way, De Morgan was constantly integrating and interlacing the classical world of antiquity and all of its rich stores of subjects with the biblical world. And here is a really interesting example because you can connect it to biblical parables of wealth of various kinds, not only the rich young man, but also someone like Zacchaeus, who responds to Jesus in a different way, who, if you like, turns around and sees the sun and is able to engage in a way that gives him a sense of faithful, mutual host and guest with Christ. And there's also something really different about this because it could certainly be related to something which is much more broadly allegorical and which could connect to a variety of subjects from antiquity. So that's an openness in De Morgan's work as well. Here, this is an image that I really like because I was also trained as an architectural historian. And so I'm always curious about the way that architecture is used in images and the way that a sense of surface and depth in this representation of a particular saint, I'll get to her in a second, is really fascinating with these people arriving in boats, the use of the steps, the idea of interior and exterior propelling us into the back of the painting again and again. And the articulacy of this scene is just, it's more complex than it needs to be. You know, it's much more complex than it needs to be. And you can see quite extraordinarily that there's some iconoclasm going on as well. You can see a broken statue in the back and someone in the foreground who is being questioned for attending to this piece of stone with a hammer, as you can see there on the first step. Meanwhile, what we have here is an image of Saint Christina giving her father's jewels to the poor. So, if you like, as a bit of sermonizing and even a little bit of moralizing, which thankfully is not what Christians do very often, at least hopefully not. I mean the moralizing, not the sermonizing. I preach sermons all the time. There is a lovely contrast that we could make here in terms of a theology of what to do with our wealth. And so St. Christina here is, in terms of the previous image, turning around and seeing that sun rise in her heart as she distributes her wealth and as she shares it. And what this reminds me of as well is a beautiful moment in the book Acts, where there is a conjoining of the community of the apostles, where they share things completely and utterly in common, and it's a bit of a socialist paradise. So from a political point of view, the kinds of images that De Morgan was drawn to are often not only images of women, but are images of a kind of a sharing, whether that's spiritual or relational, or in this case, very specifically about wealth in this particular saint. I'll get to talking about the position, as far as I can see it, of the Virgin Mary in Evelyn De Morgan's work a little bit later as well, but I wanted to show you this, partly because it's unusual in her oeuvre, and also because it helps us to see how she is combining a broader sense of spirituality with a very particular understanding of the Virgin Mary in all her many manifestations. So on the left, this is a sketch for Mater Dolorosa, Our Lady of Sorrows. And on the right, a sculpture that she produced in, I think, about 1900. And what I absolutely love about this is not only her use of textile and drapery, but also this really ambiguous and actually androgynous face. And we could really enjoy, I think, and really be moved by looking at that face for a really long time. On the one hand, she does, De Morgan does connect this to a classic trope of depicting Our Lady of Sorrows in a bust form, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment, but also is doing something quite different. One of the great things about this, I believe, is that in a way, it could be any woman. And that's part of the beauty, as well as perhaps the surprise of what she depicts here. But as I say, it is part of a wider tradition. This is one of my very favorite examples of this tradition, as well as one that we can certainly recognize in terms of De Morgan's own treatment of this subject. I have no evidence whatever that De Morgan was familiar with this sculpture, which is a Pedro de Mena, Our Lady of Sorrows, which is now in the collection of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Glass tears, real eyelashes, this heavenward gaze, the exposure of the mouth to reveal teeth within. There is something so painfully and so provocatively human about this in the furrowing of the brows, but there's also something otherworldly about this. We could certainly also speak about the problematization of its whiteness, as with so many countless European images that presume the whiteness of the Holy Family and saints and just about everybody else, really. And it would be very interesting to explore that in relation to this image and countless others. And so the extent to which identification with this image of Our Lady is possible is, I think, truncated by that. And there's a lot to say about whiteness, race, and empire, which I would love to say, but not today. It can come up in dialogue later if you wish. But there is something so precious to me about looking at this image and the tradition of this kind of sculptural representational realism, and how it's similar to De Morgan because it draws us into the story. There's something so particularized. There's something so shockingly accessible about this image. And what De Morgan is doing too, where there's this idea of the Virgin Mary as a kind of an every woman, the sorrow that every woman will experience in her life at one moment or another. I wanted to show you this too, because though it comes from a classical narrative, it relates to the expectation of life and death. So in the foreground, this beautiful image of these two very happy lovers having a nice time with this inscription beneath, and the passage, which is so it's in Latin in the text, but the passage in English is, "List we to love meanwhile in lovers' fashion. Death wears apace with darkness round his brow." And so what's happening here is that these lovers, happy as they are imagining their death and imagining the tragedy and the pain of that death, and also of getting older. So you can really see that in the background. And the angel of joy and fresh love and life playing these pipes and attending them in the foreground is a kind of reversal, or allowing the foreshadowing of this angel of death with his big scythe in the background. I've just said his. Actually, angels are remarkably and wonderfully beyond the restrictive realms and language of gender. So if I'm using any kind of gendered terms for angels, it's because I'm retraining myself. And so it's important to be able to keep that in mind as well. I wanted to connect this idea of love and ambivalence in relation to love and the passage of time to another artist named Simeon Solomon. Here on the left, Love in Autumn, and Simeon Solomon as a queer artist takes us right into the heart of sad love or lost love in terms of his own desires and struggles. That's a whole other story, but that's a little sort of nugget if you want to learn more about Solomon's life. At the same time, during his painting career in the late 19th century, De Morgan and Solomon had lots of the same friends, moved in similar circles. He is also, and this image on the right is from 1894, exploring allegory and symbolism. This is The Moon and Sleep. There is a wonderful erotic charge between these two figures without question, eyes open, eyes closed. But there is also something which I think is very interesting about the idea of darkness and light, especially with this very strong crescent, almost a halo behind that image of the moon. Simeon Solomon, because I can never resist talking about this painting ever, was also very interested in religious ritual. His family has a Jewish background, but he was just fascinated by especially the rise of high Anglicanism and Anglo-Catholicism in Britain in the late 19th century. And this image is called The Mystery of Faith. And you can see these glorious angels around the top of what looks like a reliquary, but what's actually meant to be a monstrance. I just have a generic kind of example from the V&A. It's from the 17th century of a monstrance in the lower right, so you can see what I mean. So what this is for is it's a container for the adoration of a consecrated host, for the veneration of the body of Christ revealed in this bread, which is bread for the people, but also the spiritual bread of heaven. And that coming together of heaven and earth in the sacraments is also something that Evelyn De Morgan is very interested in, though not necessarily a devout participant in these kinds of rituals. I also couldn't resist because a couple of days ago, yesterday, actually, gosh, losing track of time, the church celebrated the feast of Corpus Christi. It's the feast of the body of Christ, in which we all give thanks together for the mystery as well as the glory of the Eucharist. And so here I wanted to stick with some of the stuff that makes Evelyn De Morgan's approach to allegory interesting, and to hook it together with something else that's happening in her household, especially around the novels of William De Morgan. He published quite a few, and Somehow Good, which was published in 1908, which is apparently kind of mediocre rather than good as a novel, depends on what you're into. But if you're curious about his work, please do go and have a read. He got a lot of flack for this from priests who wrote to him and said, you've got this stuff about Catholic ritual all wrong. And actually what I'm going to do is just go back for a second so that we can see this, though it's not a De Morgan, it's a Simeon Solomon. So there's my health warning. But I couldn't resist reading out for you a letter from Father Vassal Phillips that William De Morgan got at the same time that Evelyn De Morgan was painting quite a lot of images of saints and of this relationship between spirituality, darkness, light, and heaven. And what this letter reveals is that William De Morgan kind of cares about the rituals of the church, but wants much more to create an atmosphere of the church rather than adhering too much to any particular detail. So here's Father Phillips. He pointed out that no Catholic layman knows the words of consecration or would ever dream of repeating them to his wife if he did know them. So that's one of the errors that he spotted. A final and more serious statement made by De Morgan in private correspondence, he dwelt on at great length. And so here's what De Morgan had to say about that. He said, I doubt whether any minister of religion would class me as a Christian, and I do not class myself at all. The priest responds, people who say they do not wish to class themselves either do not wish to believe or have not taken the trouble to examine the evidences. And he's underlined that, so there we are. And this correspondence goes on in the most delightful way, and it's available to read in that 1920s double biography of William and Evelyn De Morgan that I mentioned. And the example that William De Morgan uses, quite exasperated with this priest, is that he said, look, I'm a novelist, I write fiction, and I moved a polar bear from the North Pole to the South Pole for some literature that I was exploring so that I could, write another novel that I wrote. And so if I can move a polar bear from one place to the other, then surely I can have the words of consecration in the mouth of someone who, as a devout Catholic, might not normally say it. So he's like, come on, you know, let me have my art. But nevertheless, priests persisted in taking him to task. And so the next thing I wanted to show you is this. It's Evelyn De Morgan's The Soul's Prison House. A study for this work was exhibited in 1889. This painting she worked on throughout the 1880s. And I am so fascinated by the text, the quote that went along with a version of this painting with a sketch. So it's attributed to Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine of Hippo, 4th century saint, wrote the Confessions and much else besides, really focused on prayer and on biblical commentary, especially on the Psalms. Again, that's a little nugget. If you want to know more about that, we can talk about it later. You can ask me another time. And so what's happening in the soul's prison house is that there is this longing of the soul to be released from the prison of the body. And that's fascinating because that's kind of a spiritualist, almost Swedenborgian take, 18th century person who was very popular in late 19th and early 20th century circles, because he saw that the evolution of materials was always towards this ethereal heavenly realm through regeneration. That too, huge topic, but very important for both De Morgans. So she's seeing the body as a prison here. In the Christian tradition, body and soul ultimately, not this side of heaven, are not separated. There's a sense of the importance of the incarnation for ourselves, that we, like Jesus, are fully human, as well as having this incredible capacity to reach out to God through the sacraments, through prayer, through immersing ourselves in God's mystery. So this is quite a different view of body and soul. Though there are some interesting perceptions that St. Paul has about that in his letters in our New Testament corpus, where he speaks about the tangled difficulties of the desires of what he calls the flesh, sarx in Greek. So there's lots more to say here. And maybe I'm being unfair on Evelyn De Morgan by saying that she's focusing on the soul almost at the expense of, or to the detriment of, the body. So here's this quote, apparently from St. Augustine, that she used alongside this work. "Illuminate, oh, illuminate my blind soul that sitteth in darkness and the shadow of death." So I looked for this quote a fair amount. I could have looked harder, but having a look around and trying to find out precisely where this quote came from, I found something rather interesting, because I think it may have come through Francis Quarles, who was a British author in the 17th century who collected together lots of poems and sayings and put his own spin on them. So his own translations of the Psalms, for example, are part of that book. That book was republished. Well, a new edition was published in 1886, and I suspect it could have been quite popular, or at least on the shelves for the De Morgans. So he titles this Saint Augustine, a soliloquy, caption number 4, which is fascinating. I don't know anything about Quarles, but I'm on this, I'm sort of going down this rabbit hole now. And if anybody knows about this, I'd love to know. So here is what Quarles says, or how he responds to St. Augustine. "O Lord, who art the light, the way, the truth, the life, in whom there is no darkness, error, vanity, or death. The light without which there is darkness, the way without which there is wandering, the truth without which there is error. Say, Lord, let there be light, and I shall see light and eschew darkness. I shall see the way and avoid wandering. I shall see the truth and shun error. I shall see life and escape death." And here it comes. "Illuminate, oh, illuminate my blind soul, which sitteth in darkness and the shadow of death, and direct my feet in the way of peace." And you may recognize that too as a kind of translation or interpretation, expansion on Psalm 23. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." And on it goes, about seeking comfort and security in God. And I wanted to hook this together with a classic trope of the aesthetic movement as well. In the late 19th century, people absolutely loved peacocks because they were so beautiful. People absolutely loved sunflowers because they were so beautiful. And these images become much more about beauty itself and the pursuit of beauty itself than of certain kinds of moral expectations or ethical concerns in art. And so, yet, the peacock also preserves its traditional Christian iconography of being associated with resurrection. So on the right, this is an image of a memorial that Edward Burne-Jones made when one of his dear friends, Laura Littleton, died in childbirth in 1886. And I'm just comparing it here with an image by Evelyn De Morgan called The Prisoner. Again, soul and body, if we'd like to see it that way, where you can see the peacock on her dress. And there for her is this expectation of eventually a resurrection that will free her from this prison of life. Gives us an insight perhaps into how Evelyn De Morgan herself felt about the material world. A painter and a successful one, and someone who made great contributions socially and artistically, who yet was longing to kind of escape the material world, perhaps to escape her own body and freely float to heaven as a disembodied soul. This is the image that I wanted to use to attract you, I guess, to this talk. And it's an image that I wanted because it is so interesting. And it's, I think, leading us into a really fascinating place, again, in relation perhaps to Burne-Jones and Evelyn De Morgan's response to Burne-Jones's work, but also to the relationship between war and peace and conflict and freedom. So this is Our Lady of Peace, another image which can be seen as simultaneously a classical allegory and also an association with the Virgin Mary. And Christ is referred to in a reading from Isaiah, that's a whole other thing, don't worry about it, scripturally, as the Prince of Peace. And so there is this close relationship here between the need for peace, the pleading for peace on behalf of the knight, and the promise of peace in all of its cascading light and rainbow and beauty. It's as though peace is always available to the one who prays, or at least that's my sense of this. And this knight in medieval garb is most certainly also a modern Edwardian man. You can see that from the mustache. And I think there's something really important about the way that this image also relates to the Eucharist. So just in behind, you'll be able to see an altar with lit candles. And you can also see on a column that frames this painting on the right, that on the upper right, there are a series of tendrils that are moving around this column that are very delicately carved, as Evelyn De Morgan has depicted it in paint. And they're grapes. So there's this idea of the Eucharist, of that sacrament we spoke about earlier, and the way that that connects to the need for and the seeking of peace in prayer. So here's my Burne-Jones thought here. This is the final image in what he calls the Pygmalion series. It's from the 1870s, and Pygmalion is the story of the sculptor who wants to bring a sculpture to life, and as a result, Venus grants him that capacity, grants the statue that capacity, and so in the end, there he is kneeling in front of this sculpture, suddenly turned into flesh. Caroline R. Scott has done some wonderful writing about this, seeing it as a kind of a sadomasochistic image, actually, of longing and begging and loving and needing. And so if we were to put these two images together, I don't see why not, really. There is a very different kind of need, not for a certain kind of love that Edward Burne-Jones is depicting here in his classical context of the sculptor whose requirements are about companionship and also about a certain kind of unity and its relation to Venus, and the love that connects to the Eucharist and to Our Lady of Peace for the knight on the left. It's just a thought, and I would be curious to see where that leads. Also, Edward Burne-Jones and his depiction of the Merciful Knight here, where this is a story from Kenelm Digby that has earlier origins. And the idea is that it's a knight who could have killed someone in revenge violence and decides not to. And so he finds himself at a roadside shrine, and the figure of Christ embraces him. And so here we have this extremely tender image of the knight being embraced by Christ, who, as you can tell, is sort of this mixture at this point of wood and flesh. I also wanted to look at this partly because I served my curacy at Hampstead Parish Church. I was there for a couple of years. And this is a wonderful image of World War I memorial window where a soldier is about to receive the crown of glory and indeed the crown of peace, rest at the last, from Christ. Again, a really, really interesting image of an androgynous Christ in heaven. It's by the stained glass artist Joan Fullilove, who worked around the corner from the church right in the middle of Hampstead. Whether or not De Morgan and Fullilove knew one another, I have no idea, but it is a possibility. And so at this point now, I'd like to come to the end. And coming to the end means, for me in this case, I suppose, coming to the beginning of the Gospel of John, where we have this first beautifully philosophical meditation on the incarnation and its relationship to light and darkness, and that the light has come into the world and the darkness does not comprehend it. So this is called Lux in Tenebrous, light in darkness. And what I like to think of this as, though maybe this is a step too far, is Evelyn De Morgan exploring those spiritual concepts of light and darkness and the hope and the faith and the love that those things absolutely represent, and perhaps thinking about that in a Christ-like way. So could this be Evelyn De Morgan's allegorical female depiction of the Gospel of John as a whole, as a text, or indeed of Christ himself? And if you look down in the bottom, there are two alligators, which also makes this work of art particularly delightful. I'll stop there. I hope that you've enjoyed this time of learning and thinking together, and I've really enjoyed being able to take a fresh look at Evelyn Underhill, she's on my mind too, at Evelyn De Morgan's painting and the way that it relates to spirituality, spiritualism, and Christianity. So thank you so much. I have absolutely no idea what I'm meant to do next. Okay, I have a message from Sarah who says, please take questions from the chat and stop the meeting when you're done. So I'm completely in charge now, which is very surprising, but I'm perfectly happy to be. So please do put your questions in the chat. And because I don't think you can even unmute yourselves if you wanted to. I think that's the way this has been set up. So if you can type out your questions, then I will happily answer them and we can be in a bit of dialogue together. It's lovely to have lots of thank yous coming in. That's kind. Angela Thomas, do you have any comments on Evelyn's decision to exhibit her works to raise money for those affected by World War I? That's an absolutely brilliant question. I know a little bit about it, but not very much. Other people in this group will know more. My impression of it is that her core philosophy about light in darkness and about the persistence of hope, as well as her capacity to be able to actually sell her art and make money from her art, was a real driving force for that. I would love to see some work that specifically links that image of the Red Christ ascending, surrounded by angels from the battlefield, and the way that that relates to her understanding of the Great War. I would also really recommend a catalogue from an exhibition by Liz Llewellyn a few years ago that looks at the Great War. It has some wonderful examples of women artists and the way that artists campaigned to be able to raise funds and to draw attention to the kind of incredible and awful traumatic circumstances of the war. And I would love to know more about that. So Angela Thomas, if you know more, then I would love to hear about that too. And if any of you has more insight about that, then please do put it in the chat so that we can all learn together. Oh, I love this so much. Jennifer Purser, did the Church of England approve or disapprove of spiritualism? Wow. Okay, so the Church of England institutionally and its distinctiveness or differences sometimes from the way that particular people, whether clergy or laity, are exploring their own faith is sometimes quite complex. Officially, institutionally, spiritualism and the Church of England, to the best of my knowledge, don't really go together. However, there were lots and lots of people who would simultaneously be really focused on and comfortable with their affiliation to the Church of England, and also really be exploring that spiritual territory in a much broader way. And one of the best examples I can think of to look at that blend and how complex, but also how in some ways integrated, explicable it is to read work by Evelyn Underhill, who I mentioned by accident right at the end, but who's a really good companion, I think, for Evelyn De Morgan. She was a London-based writer, also a novelist, and a theologian who wrote a really fine book I recommend in this context called Practical Mysticism in 1915. She was for a while a member of one of these esoteric societies, the Golden Dawn. She was very interested in theosophy. I think she did have a curiosity about Swedenborg and that little tiny nugget I mentioned earlier. And she also nearly became Roman Catholic, and then ultimately became received into the Church of England in 1921. So interesting. Hampstead Parish Church is where Evelyn Underhill's resting place is. And there's a new project to have a ledger stone placed on her grave so that she is able to be celebrated in her own right in a new way. And there's lots of celebration going on around that. So if you want to learn more about Evelyn Underhill, and if you want to experience the delight of Church of England services, this is my plug for this. It's so funny I'm doing this. I'm really sorry, but quite frankly, you're just putting questions in the chat, so I could talk forever, which I'm not going to. This is one thing. So in the morning, there's a Eucharist at 10:30, where Lord Bishop Richard Harries will preach. And then in the evening at 6 o'clock on the 13th of June, I'm preaching, and we'll be saying some things about Underhill, and maybe based on this today, be including some things about Evelyn De Morgan and spirituality as well. We'll see. So let's see, what else have we got here? Have I written about Evelyn De Morgan and her works? Oh, that's kind. At the moment, Evelyn De Morgan feels like someone who's sort of safe up here. I'm working on an article about that stained glass window by Joan Fullylove that I showed you. And I think it could be really fruitful to bring in some of those little ideas that I've been thinking about and sharing with you today into that work. And in fact, you've just made me realize something that I'm quickly going to write down. So the short answer is no. And the double the length answer is not yet. Let me see, Emily McConkey. Ah, yeah, De Morgan's crossing of classical and biblical references. What a lovely question. I think that her education, not only in art, but much more broadly, is an education that naturally fits those two things together. I don't know whether she had Latin and Greek. I would love to know. Clearly, she's using Latin inscriptions in her paintings. She is also part of a much wider world where classical allegory and narratives are connecting and being in dialogue with and sitting alongside biblical material all the time. Part of that is the inheritance of Western European history painting, how people are trained and how people reflect those stories back to one another, especially since the Renaissance. There's always that merging of worlds. Part of it, I think, has to flow through Evelyn Underhill, I've got to stop doing that, through Evelyn De Morgan's way of being very open to something that is going in both directions, but also in a kind of constellation across many experiences of just what it is to be human. So that thing about darkness and light, you get those tropes in biblical as well as in classical narratives. And you get some really, really interesting things in her work, which I think may have to do with her interest in Dante. If anybody knows about that, tell me, let me know, where you have, of course, Dante and Virgil, and they're going through hell, purgatory, and heaven. So that blending together that goes right the way through. And even before that, you see this in medieval art as well. So she's inheriting that. And the way that she works with it is unique, but also part of a really big, long tradition. Ah, Barbara Alden. Hello, Barbara. Did she do any specific art as a result of seances? I would love to know. I would absolutely love to know. I have no idea, and I would love to find out. I think this book, which William and Evelyn De Morgan published anonymously, probably wouldn't tell us all that much directly because they're trying to sort of make sure that it's a bit distant from them in their careers. But if we were able to look at some of the images that she's producing at the same time that she's engaging in those seance practices, I would be just so fascinated to see how those things are coming together. I wonder too whether or not more generally the insights that she felt she was receiving from the spirit world. And there's this great anecdote where she was walking through Battersea Park and she believed that she saw a ghost, and she came home and she said, "I've just seen a wraith." And the people who were at home were like, "Oh, that's just the thing you do all the time." And so there we are. And that makes me want to read something to you, which I hope I've got with me. Yes, here we go. So this is their daughter, okay? Mary made jest of matters which to her mother were entirely convincing. In one instance, when the subject of spiritualism was under discussion in a room full of earnest believers, all profoundly impressed with their individual experiences, she threw her evidence into the opposite scale with a decisiveness which descended upon her audience with the effect of a bombshell. "I was at a seance lately," she announced in her clear, penetrating voice, "and there were 7 people present. Each of them had recently lost a relation, and they had come to communicate with the deceased. There was a materialization, and each of the 7 persons at once recognized it to be the relation he or she had lost. They all began to quarrel when anyone else claimed it, and in the end, all became violently abusive. I saw in it only the medium dressed up." So she's going to these things, but I think she also and she absolutely believes that there is this thin, gauzy, permeable layer between heaven and earth. But she's also, she's not foolish. She's not taken in by the almost infinite number of tricks that those who were performing seances would do. But Evelyn De Morgan also was very close with someone who she and William De Morgan believed had some real gifts and skills as a medium. She unfortunately died in her 20s, but she, had this real, capacity for this. They understood. And there was this skepticism because she was doing some table rapping on one corner of the room that was near where she was. And so they were like, "Make that other piece of furniture do that." And so she stayed where she was, and on the other corner of the room, there was some table rapping, and they were really curious about that, impressed by that. And so there was a great sense of mystery and openness, but also a kind of sense of realism in the midst of the possibility of the spiritual world communicating with them. Jane, hello Jane. Edward Burne-Jones's Golden Stairs and Evelyn De Morgan, St. Catherine. Good question. I think Burne-Jones is a little bit earlier, but this is one of those things which is also, thankfully, easy to look up. No. I think St. Catherine of Alexandria is earlier because I feel like Burne-Jones's Golden Stairs is early 1880s, but that's like really, I feel like I'd have to look at the Tate website and see. But the sketch that I showed you is from 1876, and it was her, no, it isn't. I'm sorry, that's St. Catherine of Oh, you mean St. Christina on the stairs? Yeah. Sorry, forget everything I just said. The Burne-Jones Golden Stairs painting, which many of you will have seen. It's a bunch of women playing musical instruments coming down some stairs, and it's open with a kind of a skylight with doves above. It's a mesmerizing long painting. And St. Christina giving her father's jewels to the poor with all that architecture in the background, 1904. So Edward Burne-Jones first. Let me see. Right. And I think it's 1300 hours. It's exactly 1 o'clock. And I think that's all the questions that people have got, as far as I can tell. I'm absolutely delighted to have been able to spend some time with all of you this afternoon. It's always surreal on Zoom doing these webinars because I know that there are 20 of you here, that there have been nearly 30 over the course of the last hour. And some of the names I recognize, and it's wonderful to be able to see some of you in the chat as well. And otherwise, if we were physically in a room together, we could, I don't know, go and have some coffee afterwards, or I'd be able to interact with you more. But as it is, we are still limited by this medium. So I hope that you've really enjoyed spending time looking at Evelyn De Morgan's work today, and it's a pleasure to be with you. So I'm going to pretend to be Sarah and wish you well, though perhaps not entirely on behalf of the De Morgan collection, and hope you're all doing well. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.